Have you tried buying some food in the recent times? The prices are through the roof. Not only in Sri Lanka, globally, food inflation is over 50%, and the impending global food shortage is indeed the talk of the town. Hello and welcome to Bisnomics, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. I'm Talandu Amarasekara. Our focus today will be on the current rising food prices, how Sri Lankans are affected by this. Does Sri Lanka have a plan to get out of this mess? And most importantly, some of the recent decisions such as the ban on fertilizers, how has that aggravated the problem for the economy of Sri Lanka even more? This will be our focus today. And joining me, actually returning back to our show, is none other than Mr. Rizvi Zaheed, who is the chairman of the Sri Lanka Agripreneurs Association. Rizvi, absolute pleasure to welcome you. We are welcoming you back at a crucial time to talk on a topic which is quite close to your heart, I believe. And welcome to Bisnomics once again.
Thank you. Great pleasure to be here.
Rizvi, the last time we spoke, there was a lot of comments and there's a lot of views for our episode and discussion as well. And you mentioned some of the challenges that the agriculture sector of Sri Lanka is facing and some of the mistakes we had done. However, things were not that bad. We were not speaking of global food shortages or local food shortages at that point of time. Of course, Russia had not attacked Ukraine at that point of time, and we also didn't have some of the complications which we are having now. But let's cut to the chase. Let's look at the current scenario. How bad is the global food shortage going to be?
It's pretty precarious, Sarindu. If you look at the world in 2021, there were 193 million people across 53 countries in the various territories across the globe that were affected by acute food insecurity, or one of the worst levels as defined by the FAO. What this means is that more and more people around the globe are not getting the food that they require to maintain healthy lifestyles, to maintain their nutrition at the desired levels, and this is fueled by increase in prices and a whole multitude of factors.
Rizvi, I believe we are talking here about basic food. We are not talking about the barbecues or the tandooris or the pastas or anything. We are looking at basic, bare minimum meal which we need for a proper nutrition system to be within us. Am I right?
Exactly. This is the basic necessities that a human being requires. And when we say very acute levels of insecurity, it means that the situation is really bad globally. And the danger is that whilst 40 million people were added to the 193 million people in this level in 2021, and the situation is going to get even worse in 2022 because of a whole multitude of factors that have affected global food supply chains across the world, from the basic things to all the nice to eat things as well. Everything is going to get affected.
Understood. And what are the factors that have contributed to this? Let's talk about the Russian attack on Ukraine. Let's talk about some of the issues with regard to lack of energy sources for some of the key markets. Let's talk about how some leading agriculture countries, export countries, are now banning agriculture exports because they want to keep the agriculture output for themselves. I believe Russia, Ukraine was called the breadbasket of the world. And I read a very interesting scenario, Rizvi, where Egypt, one of the biggest consumers of wheat, this time, and it's a predominantly Islamic country, and during the Ramadan season, they were not able to even source the required wheat for make their rotis and their bread. This is, as you said, a very precarious situation. But I'd like to go into depth with you. What are the factors that have contributed to this global food shortage and the rising food prices as at now?
I think it's a very important question, Tari, to look at what are the causal factors, because it's not something that has happened overnight. Of course, there were trigger factors, as you said rightfully, the crisis in Eastern Europe, the Ukraine-Russian crisis, etc. But if you go back, there were three major drivers that affected food supplies across the world. The fundamental first one, of course, is conflict. And conflict has disrupted food chains across the world, of course, the latest being the Eastern European crisis as well, but conflicts of every kind across all the continents have disrupted food chains and food supply. If you look at the concept of conflict, even in Sri Lanka, when we had the situation of our civil strife many years ago, and then if you look at the various types of conflicts even in India, in terms of farmers striking in the Punjab, or even where countries like Iran have been sanctioned, or now even Russia, the conflict situation is a principal influence on disrupting food supply. So even global entities like the G7, the big European entities, the Asian, ASEAN entities always try to address this, but conflict is a principal driver. So that's something that global leaders need to focus on, and regional leaders need to focus on, is whenever they get themselves into conflict, there is a consequence to pay for food security. That's number one. The second one, of course, is climate change, adverse weather factors, which again in the main is man-made due to the effects of deforestation, the absence of controlling rising sea levels, the temperatures.
If you're talking about man-made, I mean, we are looking at a scenario where over the next 10 years, the Amazon, lungs of the planet Earth, might be in a savanna situation, because I believe the Brazilian government is giving out plots of land to be cultivated,
Absolutely.
but it damages the ecosystems in to such a bad extent.
Absolutely. So the second big driver of this food shortage and the food crisis is climate change impacts, weather, and how man can influence the weather by addressing all these factors that are affected at the climate change conferences globally. Correct. And that nation states to give a lot of attention to climate change impact, whether it's flooding or droughts or other types of climate change impact. So number two driver of these factors that contribute to food security is weather and climate change impacts. And of course the third one is the economic shocks. The economic shocks, of course, are driven sometimes by political factors as well, but if you look at the various types of factors that have affected global food supply, for example, the COVID pandemic caused an economic shock in terms of distribution, in terms of supply chains, oil price rises, the increase in natural gas prices globally causes economic shocks in terms of the supply of agricultural inputs like fertilizer, etc., as well as in distribution and transport and logistics. So the economic shocks are also important factors that have contributed to a serious deterioration in the food supply chains globally.
Now let's talk about specific types of crop which are under threat here. I believe especially when it comes to wheat, it's a huge factor, and wheat is a staple food for so many different economies around the world, Rizvi, and even maize. Those prices are up, and some of these are up by more than 50%, 80%. Global food index has risen by more than 50% over the last 1 year. So which types of crops and food are at the highest risk? We also talk about meat. Today meat consumption is quite common even among some of the low income countries in the world, but meat prices are also going up. What types of crop and food are at the highest risk of these shortages and this food inflation, Rizvi?
I think the principal driver of the crisis in the Ukraine and Russia is of course the food crop, which is wheat, because wheat, both Russia and Ukraine account for 30% of the wheat that is fed to the world.
Correct.
Because it's a breadbasket of Europe, and also feeds, as you rightfully said a little while ago, Egypt and North Africa, and all of those countries, even the Middle East, depend heavily on the wheat that comes out of Eastern Europe. So that's a crop that's going to get heavily affected. Prices have risen as well, and that's something that is going to have a massive impact. Of course, if you look at the Ukraine situation, which is a trigger for wheat supplies, is that the farmers, that's a very simple thing, who were involved in cultivating the wheat fields are now drawn into the battlefields. So they become soldiers and they're not tilling the land, and also the existing crop of wheat that was available in the Ukraine and in Russia can't find markets. So there is one side of the world that wants the wheat, and the other factor is the political dimension of sanctions. So the Russians can't export their wheat, the Ukrainian stocks can't come out because of conflict and the war and the transport, and the whole trading system is in a perfect storm as well. So wheat is number one. Of course, there are other crops in the same region like sunflower, the cooking oils, even the corn and the maize is going to get heavily reduced in supply because of the conflict. Of course, if you come to our context, there is going to be impact on things like poultry and milk, and already you can see that in Sri Lanka with the disruption caused by the foreign exchange crisis, the milk powder. Correct. So it's a whole mess of crops that probably can't reach consumers. In some areas there are surpluses, but it's a supply chain issue that can't bring those crops to market. So it's a whole range of crops, but the 4 that I mentioned are some of the key food items that are going to be affected for Sri Lanka and the globe as well.
What exactly led to the food shortage in Sri Lanka? Could that have been averted? Let's talk about that on the other side of this break. This is Bisnomics. Welcome back to Bisnomics, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. Our focus today is on the global food crisis and the impact on Sri Lanka due to that. And we are in conversation with Mr. Rizvi Zaheed. Rizvi, let's talk about the Sri Lankan situation. Now, I believe there were lots of policies that were taken, very ad hoc policies, without proper research insight also, where those policy decisions have also led to the current mess that we are in. I believe our Maha season cultivating output was far less than what it normally was. I mean, these are the hard, harsh facts and truth that the people of this country deserve to know. There's no point in sugarcoating over these matters anymore. Now, what are the specific reasons that led to this food crisis in Sri Lanka? Because we see that government officials are coming and saying, grow whatever you can. And we've heard even in some of the urban areas of Sri Lanka, such as in Colombo, they are trying to get land and grow food. Clearly, it's a red alert. The red light is glowing and beeping. The alarm sounds are beeping with regard to the food situation in Sri Lanka. But let's understand what really led us to this situation, because whatever said and done, we have always been a country, no matter what problem, there was always food to eat in this country. And now we seem to be not having that luxury as well. What is your view on this?
Firstly, Sri Lanka was affected by the pandemic. The whole food supply chain in Sri Lanka was affected during the pandemic. As you know, we had lots of problems with food, getting food from farmers to the distribution centers and to consumers. And in the post-pandemic period also, there were a lot of factors that were negative that disrupted the whole food supply chain. But in a nutshell, the real cause of the food crisis now is nothing but pure mismanagement of the economy. That's a hard reality that we all have to face. And it stems from the policy with regard to agriculture, which was number 1. Then number 2 is the foreign exchange crisis that has currently hit us, which impacted the ability to be able to source all the agri inputs that we required, from the fertilizers to the agrochemicals to the equipment to the machinery and the planting material and the seeds, and all of those got affected. So as a result, those inputs could not reach farmers in time and they could not cultivate. Of course, for our benefit, we had favorable weather, as you said, in the reasonably favorable weather during the Maha season and even in the current Yala season, but the absence of input really impacted the cultivation of the land, so much so that we see outputs being even as much as 50% less than what it should be. So that's one of the critical factors, I would call it, the mismanagement of the economy, particularly relating to agriculture, the misplaced notion of subsidies, which again should have been directed in a more transparent manner and in a more logistic manner as well. So I think one of the key reasons is this, the policies, as you said rightfully, the policies have not been thought of very well. They have been ad hoc, they have been introduced by not looking at some of the scientific aspects of the introduction of policies. And the best example, maybe we can elaborate on that a little later, is the ban on the fertilizer subsidies.
On what basis and what grounds was that, Rizvi?
I would believe the intentions were honest and the intentions were clear, is that to help reduce the incidence of negative toxic substances, etc. But it was not a balanced decision, and it was not based on scientific evidence. Usually, a policy before it is implemented, the stakeholders are always consulted, because all the stakeholders can give input from the scientific or academic community, from the agriculturalists, from the farmers themselves, and from those players who are involved in the provision of a relevant input, like in this case the fertilizer. That consultation just happened. It was a dictate from the powers that be, and of course it could have been on the basis of some advice. So if the advice was given by people who were misguided or who had a vested interest, clearly the outcome of that policy was very clear. in that it basically destroyed agriculture. And late as it was, there was an admission that that policy was a mistake, and it is a very costly mistake.
Correct.
Because the whole country and agriculture suffered, and restoring even some form of organic farming, even a limited scale, is going to be extremely difficult, because the farmers do not trust and believe that this is something that can help them, because they have been economically devastated.
And in terms of the segments of the Sri Lankan society that are most vulnerable from this food shortage and crisis, what are your thoughts on that, Rizvi?
This is a very sorry situation, Tarindu, with regard to the segments of society that are going to be affected. It is not only adding to this 193 million people who are going to be affected adversely globally. It is also that it is going to impact the nutrition and health of the people of Sri Lanka. And when we talk of vulnerable segments of our society, the two most vulnerable are our young people. Already child malnutrition in Sri Lanka is at a very high level, and add to that this current crisis, we can see a huge impact on the well-being and health of our children of Sri Lanka, and the vast majority of them require nutrition at this age in order for them to reap the benefits of the good things that the country has done. So children are going to be enormously affected by the absence of adequate amounts of food and nutrition, and it is going to help their physical and mental well-being. The other segment of society, or the segment that is going to be severely affected, of course, is the elderly, who are prone to illnesses, who need to have nutritious immunity boosting foods, they need balanced diets, and the elderly population are going to be severely impacted. That does not mean that the people in between, the middle-aged people, etc., will not be affected. They will also get impaired in terms of their health and nutrition, so very vulnerable. Apart from this, those segments of society that are going to get affected is all the players in the agricultural value chain. From the farmers themselves, they are going to not have enough incomes. We can see that already. They missed a couple of crops. There is going to be the providers of inputs, and all the players involved in the provision of inputs, from those who develop the inputs like the fertilizers and the agrochemicals, the seeds and the planting materials, the provision of equipment, the post-harvest people, the transport people, the logistics, and even the financiers, whether it is with the informal sector or formal sector, are going to be affected when you see a reduction in the level of agricultural activity that is going to happen. So all these stakeholders are going to be affected, but I said the vulnerable segments are in the main the very young, children, and the elderly as well.
Rizvi, when you talk about yourself, you are a leader among the agri entrepreneurs, you work very closely with the farmers. How about the impact of the inflation on these farmers, on these agripreneurs? Because if you look at it, a bag of fertilizer, that used to be a couple of thousands, is now sometimes 15,000, 20,000 even. There are talks of some black markets having it for 35,000, right? And the prices have shot up tremendously, and on top of that, you can't even find the required input. Tell us, what are they going through, and simply how horrid is the situation that they are facing?
The impact of inflation is crippling every element of our society, because people can't afford. There is no increase in the level of output, so price levels are going to go higher and higher. And for the farmer and the agricultural community, at the end of the day, it is about getting a reasonable return. It is the economics of production. Up to now, Sri Lankan farmers enjoyed some amount of subsidy, even though that subsidy could have been better utilized in form of output subsidies or in the form of subsidy for use of new technologies. But the bulk, or nearly all of it, went into fertilizers for reasons best known to the policymakers and the politicians. So when the input prices of fertilizer go up and there is not going to be a subsidy, farmers are going to feel a huge crunch. But on the other hand, because the farm gate prices are going to go higher, it is a vicious spiral really. Consumers will have to contend with higher prices, and if the consumers can't pay for the higher prices, and the farmers themselves has to finance the higher level of the input costs because of the increase, because of the inflation, they will have to go to money lenders or the banking sector, and that adds on to their costs. Now then, after they produce an unit of rice or vegetables or any types of agricultural output, if they can't get the price at which they will cover their costs, that is disaster. It is going to result in surpluses, it is going to result, and food is a perishable commodity.
Correct.
If there is no proper storage, and Sri Lanka has a huge dearth of storage and post-harvest technologies. So, that is going to lead to a very disastrous situation, apart from the affordability aspects of inflation, which is going to affect the amount of food that is going to be produced. Of course, if there are ways in which it can be financed, that is good, but again the market dynamics will come into play, and if farmers do not get an adequate high level of prices at farm gate, they are going to sit on a huge amount of surplus, and the people in Sri Lanka will not be able to afford those high priced agricultural products, as we see already happening now.
Correct.
If you look at tomatoes, 1,200 rupees a kilo, rice prices are going up, the vegetable prices are going up, and you said rightfully at the beginning, globally and in Sri Lanka, the food index is just going sky high. It is totally unmanageable right now.
So, things are quite ugly, but it can become a totally worse and a totally different nightmare altogether at the current rate that we are in. Some very interesting insights from you, Rizvi, on that. How can you as a citizen adjust for this upcoming food crisis, and what do you need to know about your own personal consumption? Let us talk about that on the other side of this short break. This is Bisnomics. Welcome back to Bisnomics. Our focus today is on the crisis in the agri sector, the impending food shortage, and what do you need to know about it. And we are in conversation with Rizvi Zaheed. Rizvi, let us talk about another important sector, that is the dairy sector. Now, already we see shortages of milk powder. Even in a supermarket, unless you know some of the people, you can't get a milk powder packet. And if you have milk powder in your basket, everyone asks, from where did you get that, from where did you get that? I mean, we were not a country that we had that issue even as much as last year. But now when we talk to the dairy sector, they say no, due to certain fertilizer issues, we haven't been able to really grow the grass that is required for the cows, and as a result the milk output is less. And you know, it's one thing leads to another, but it's all the way spiraling down to a totally I would say a new nadir, or the lowest point of the river, as we say. It's always spiraling down to a new nadir with these different interconnected food issues. What are the main problems that the dairy sector is facing now? Because let us admit, there are a lot of small time farmers and entrepreneurs in the dairy sector as well. How bad is the situation there, and when do you think we will start to see some milk powder in the supermarket shelves?
There are two things. One is that the milk powder in the main is imported from countries overseas. So, milk powder comes in from countries overseas, and the local dairy sector was shaping up very nicely. There are some interesting players who already invested heavily in the local dairy sector for production of milk. They have produced, making use of the milk supply chain to procure liquid milk from farmers and then convert that into powdered milk, as well as into milk in pasteurized form, in Tetra packs.
We don't have we more than a fresh milk culture. What we have in Sri Lanka is more of a powdered milk culture. I mean, for convenience, for ease, not everyone can afford fridges, especially now. So, you go with milk powder.
Sure, because of two factors. One is the price of milk powder globally just before all of this crisis hit, and of course, the current foreign exchange shortage has severely impacted the ability to import milk powder, and of course, the price when it is available as well. So, there is a huge gap in demand between the restriction or reduced availability of milk powder, and your question, how the local dairy sector can rise to the occasion in fulfilling the need. So, the dairy sector has been doing a lot in this area, and even the government institutions like the NLDB, many efforts were made, even including bringing good Frisian and Jersey cows, good breeds from Australia, etc., to supplement the local breed and to up the average milk yields per cow per day.
But correct me if I am wrong, but there is a concern there as well, that some of those cows were actually not in a position to actually help the milk producer, that they were too sick or they were weak. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there is usually a big gap sometimes between well-intentioned policy and the actual implementation.
There you are.
And this implementation of that program was fraught with a lot of issues in terms of the quality, in terms of making available the feed for those cows, and the calving, and a lot of issues in that area. So that's a huge different subject altogether, but definitely that was one of the moves in the right direction, but badly implemented, and that caused a huge
Usual
impairment.
story in Sri Lanka, unfortunately.
Yes, yes. So there are a lot of issues involved in the dairy sector, but I must say there is a silver lining, because the demand for local milk is there, and a lot of the dairy players are very interested, and also to connect up with smallholders, and interesting models are being developed. It's
Even
just
now.
that even now, it's just that they need a lot of support from the government side, from policy side, to be able to make available, as you said, rightfully the grasses. In some instances you have to import parent stocks of grasses, and then you grow it in Sri Lanka, so there are quarantine laws and various other things. But in the main, there is a huge opportunity, and I think the dairy sector, with the right set of policies and encouragement and incentives, can rise to the occasion, although fraught with a lot of issues just yet.
Understood. What are the economic implications of these current food shortages, Rizvi? Because when people are not having the right food, or when people can't afford to buy the food, let's talk on that fact as well, because there are interesting comparisons. What you could buy with 500 rupees, even if you are buying a packet of rice, what you can buy with 500 rupees in 2020, in 2021, and now in 2022, we both know what we can really get for 500 rupees. What are the economic implications of these developments?
Yeah, firstly, it impacts the growers enormously, because if you look at the example, for example, vegetable consumption, if you go to the supermarkets, or if you go to the wet markets or the economic centers, you can see there is a certain volume of vegetables coming in. If you look at the supermarkets, it's very clear, and I know for sure that the supermarkets have about a 50% reduction in sales of vegetables.
And the supermarket prices have gone up by more than 37%.
It's driven by the price increases, and it's driven by the purchasing power.
And choices are also less.
And choices are less as well. So what does this mean in terms of the economic impacts? Is that the farmers won't be able to sell the volumes that they're selling earlier. The other impact is in terms of all the value chain partners in the provision of the inputs, in the provision of the various types of storage systems, the transport systems. All of them employ people, and all of those people will have less income. So it's a huge knock-on effect in terms of the economic impact. The principal impact economically is on farmers and their incomes, and the fact that over 30% of our population is involved in agriculture, and their incomes are going to be affected, has got huge implications in terms of our GDP, and in terms of the income levels of people, and in terms of the pure sustainability of people's lives as well.
Understood. Let's talk about how individuals need to adjust, because you and I, we need to face this. We need to weather this storm as citizens of the country together with the rest of this nation. How can we be ready for this food shortage? How do we need to adapt to be able to live in Sri Lanka during this food shortage crisis?
I think that's a very good question, and I'd like to respond to that in terms of the impact on two key segments of our society. As we all know, there are people who are fixed income earners, who are salaried, who get a fixed amount of pension holders, who are employees in companies or government employees, and they are fixed income earners. There is an impact on them which is huge, and what can they do? And of course, there is the other category, who are the non-fixed income earners, who are people involved in trade, the business community, the entrepreneurs whose incomes vary based on the level of economic activity or trade or manufacturing they engage in. Now in terms, I'll go to the second category. Those who are fortunate enough to have income that is not fixed, they are eating a certain amount of food. So they need to look at lifestyle changes. They need to look at whether they have to reduce in their consumptions to make available, if they were having sumptuous meals. It's a lifestyle change thing that is required. It's a very personal thing, since you asked the question how individuals can adapt.
Rizvi, are you asking me to shift to a smaller plate?
I think all of us have to face that reality, even if it's for some time. And the other issue is that the second category of people who can afford, even today if you see people still enjoy going out and eating, but it's going to hit very soon.
Friday nights, most of the party spots in Colombo are packed.
Yes, I know that, yes. So they need also to reduce the waste of food.
Correct.
Because if you look at it, around the whole of Sri Lanka, still the people who can afford food waste a lot.
And on a daily basis, even in Colombo alone, there are tons of food wasted.
Exactly. So they need to find ways so that whatever they save has to be given to, now going back to that first category, the fixed income earners are really going to feel the pinch of this food crisis that's coming, and it's going to come as early as September. So they will have to make do, very sad to say, instead of 3 meals, make do with 2 meals or 1 meal a day. It's
Wow.
really tragic, right? Then of course for these fixed income earners, there are some creative, innovative options available, and that is that even if you don't have a big garden, you can still do some home gardens. You can, for example, manioc, right, cassava, you can plant it in sticks, in grow bags, even if you are living in an apartment, in your balconies, for example, or you can grow green leafy vegetables, for example. So people have to, again, these fixed income earners need to look at lifestyle changes where they spend leisure time doing things like traveling or reading or watching TV.
You the farming.
Do a little bit of farming at home, grow your own home garden, and of course lead frugal lives. It's easier said than done, and it's going to be traumatic, which brings me to another thing that individual needs to do is they need to seek help. And I think civil society and through mainstream media and even social media talk about how you manage your emotions, how you ride through crisis, how you seek help from others, and I think there are some good insights coming here. People who can afford are starting to provide food to each other. There's even talk of creating soup kitchens, for example.
What exactly is a soup kitchen and how does that work?
It's mostly based on a charitable thing where people who can afford get together and have a little outlet somewhere. I've seen it already happening. Some people are distributing food packs. So you create an amount of money, or you collect amount of money, and you develop a broth or food with some bread, and you give it out to anybody who comes past. So that it's something that can help sustain. So we need to see a lot of this social activism also coming into play, so that the people who can afford, and the whole concept of charity, being charitable and being caring, and Sri Lanka is a country which has people who care for each other. I mean,
ranked among the top 10 in terms of giving.
Exactly, exactly. So that must be turned to a strength in this time of crisis, where we become charitable and open and start to help each other. If we ourselves are eating 3 meals, we need to reduce the quantum of that and share some of those food around, and those mechanisms, I think fueled by mainstream media as well as social media, can help, and I think that is something that every individual citizen of Sri Lanka has to think about. Now even today you can see, even you have the 3-wheel drivers waiting in queues, they don't have income. I have seen people walking past and giving them also some food. So it's a question of being charitable and sharing. And the other thing, Tharani, is with regard to addressing this personal thing to be done, we need to look at both the immediate term resolution of the issues, which is through what we just discussed, as well as medium and long term. We need to be thinking about, as you rightfully said, the next Maha season. Do we need to all influence policymakers to ensure that we have the fertilizers we require, and other long term measures like making land available for productive use. Today about 65% of the arable land in the country is in the hands of the state, and sad to say the bulk of that is underutilized or unutilized. So if there can be mechanisms, and we need to address that both as a short term and long term thing, is to make that land available for even young people who can be entrepreneurs. And today young people are ruling Sri Lanka in literally, right, to influencing public policy. So they can be given opportunities to become agricultural entrepreneurs, make use of these plots of land, and use new technologies, use modern agricultural technologies, which can be facilitated by a good strong agricultural policy, which is currently in the making and which I am part of as well. Which
Fantastic to hear that, Rizvi.
Yes, which will bring respect and value to agriculture amongst young people, because they can use drone technologies, they can use protected agriculture, and all of these things is something that Sri Lanka needs for the immediate and long term, and this I think is something that every individual needs. Of course, above all of this, there has to be leadership. Leadership not just at the political level, but leadership at community levels as well, to have this thought leadership of being contributory towards economic activity, and in this case to contribute towards our food, because without food we are going to get affected, and globally and even regionally every country is going to close up on their food supplies.
Correct.
Earlier, if you have a food supply or shortage, we look to India to import from Thailand.
India has also banned wheat exports.
Exactly, lot of countries, even as you said Egypt earlier,
Correct,
has banned. So that's going to make Sri Lankans want to focus more on what we can do in Sri Lanka through the measures I just presented.
Rizvi, Zaheed, it was an absolute pleasure to welcome back you to Bisnomics and have your expert opinion. Glad to hear that some of the brilliant minds in agriculture such as yourself are now involved in shaping the agriculture policy. We hope the right people will listen to proper advice from individuals like you and take the agriculture system of Sri Lanka into the right path. Thank you for joining us today and best of luck.
Thank you, my pleasure.
No matter what industry you may be in, having access to proper food and a proper agriculture system in the country is an absolute necessity. Today we discussed what needs to be done to make that a possibility and the possible impact of the food crisis. It's going to be a tough time ahead, but as always, together as one nation, we shall overcome. I'm Tharindra Amarasekara, and no matter what business you may be in, have a profitable week ahead. I'll see you with the next episode. This is Bisnomics.